Hello everybody, good evening. Be welcome to the class number 4 of PHP programming. My name is David Presutis, and today we're going to work with OOP, I mean Object-Oriented Programming, and we're going to build some functions for connecting to our database. As well as we were speaking in the class number 2, with PHP, it's very easy to connect our PHP program to different database servers. For example, MySQL, which is a native um, database. In fact, PHP was created for connecting with the MySQL database server natively. But we also can connect our PHP program or our PHP system to a SQL Server database from Microsoft, Postgre, Oracle, and a lot of more. So let's start. The first thing, as we know, we have to be sure of is that our web service are running okay. In our case, just because of university rule, we're working with XAMPP, so I'm going to start the virtual web server. We're calling to our control panel and I'm going to explain one more time what is every one of these two functions on our XAMPP control panel. A page is a web server emulator. In my case, an emulator because I'm using it just to make my computer work as a web server. The principal function of this server is to enable the port number 80. So this way, my equipment is going to be able to receive HTTP requests and provide responses through the PHP interpreter. We have to remember that PHP is an integrated language program. It's not a compilated language program. So the program is going to be read line by line, and if something is wrong in one line, the interpreter is going to launch a message speaking about what is the error that is happening at that moment. So the other service is the port number 3306, and we're going to need it to establish a connection with our database service. In this case, it's going to be in MySQL. Once the system is running, once our web services are running, we can start writing our program. So, what are we going to do? I'm going to start my code editor. In my case, I'm using Sublime Text. You can use PHP Storm, Visual Studio Code, no matter what your favorite code editor. So I like to type program directly, just because I can maintain the code really fresh in my mind. So I like to use Sublime Text just because it's a very basic instrument to coding, and it's very important to know that when we're going to work with a project, with a heavy project, and we have short time to finish the project, we can use other code editors or IDEs. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a new file. And this file is going to be saved in a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder practice 3. But when we're working with XAMPP, when we're working with XAMPP, it's very important to know that we have to save our files in the folder XAMPP, and at the same time inside the htdocs folder, just because the PHP interpreter is going to try to find the file through the AD port number 80. So here we go. We are inside the right folder. We're going to specify what's the kind of file. And now I'm going to create my class. We already know the basic principles, all the basic rules of the object-oriented programming. So you know what's a class, you know what's a function or object inside class, you know what's a method, you know what's a member, and you know what's an instance. So what we're going to do today is just to put in practice all that theory that was treated in the last class. So this class, I can use the name read, and I'm going to call it ORIN just because I decide, and I have to specify the extension. Now I'm going to start my PHP text. And here we go. Now that we know what a class is, to create a new class, we have to use the reserved word class, and we're going to specify what's the name of the class. In this case, I'm going to call it ORIN just because I want. What's the meaning of ORIN? It's Object Relationship Management. Just because one of the things I'm going to do inside one of the functions of this class is just to establish a connection with my SQL database server, I decided to call this array. Now, I'm going to open and close the keys, and inside I'm going to write my class logic. I'm going to create my objects inside the class. The first object I'm going to create is just a public function. Remember, we have to respect the basics of the OOP, and one of these basics is the encapsulation. There are three types of definition for objects: public, protected, and private. And just because I want to instance this function for connecting with my database from other file, from other objects inside the system, I'm going to declare a public function. I'm going to use the function KL to convert it into no capital letters, and here we go. This public function, I have to define what's going to be the name for it, and I'm going to call this function connection just because I'm going to use it to connect to my database. The first thing I'm going to do is to declare a global variable. Remember, we have two types of variable scopes: global scope and local scope. In this case, just because I'm going to need to use the variable a lot of times, and in every function inside my class and outside it, I'm going to use the global reserved word, and I'm going to call this variable connect. This is not the best practice if we want to respect the encapsulation rule, but we are learning. This is our first OOP program. So this is our first OOP application, and it's very normal to use this. So I recommend to use protected variables, so you can define what are going to be the objects which can reach the content of this variable, just because this variable is going to have as a value the functions what are going to be to connect to our database. So now I'm going to define the value for the variable connect. Connect is going to be equal to a new calling or a new instantiation of a native PHP function. Remember, in this case, we're working with pure OOP. So we have to be very familiar with terms like instance, calling, functions, native functions, methods. So I'm going to make a new call to a native function PHP, and this function is MySQLi. MySQLi is a function which is responsible to establish a connection with the database. This function is inside a native PHP class. So I'm making a new call to this native function. This function is going to have arguments inside it. But what are these arguments? We have to define what's the host or server. We have to define what's going to be the user who is going to try to establish the connection to the database. We have to define what's the password, and we have to define what's the name of the database that I'm trying to connect to. Just because we're working with a local connection, I can use the local host, or I can use the virtual IP address 127.0.0.1. But if I'm trying to connect to an external database which is in a remote server, I can use the IP address. It must be a validated IP address, or I can use the DNS, right? Or another connection parameter. So I'm going to work with localhost. It's the same thing if I write my local IP here. For this case, we're working with root. Root is the main user of my SQL database. By default, root comes with no path. This is not very safe because in every system we have to try to use the most secure method that's possible it can be. So it's not recommendable to use this, okay? But just because it's our first practice establishing a database connection, I'm going to do it, okay? So I'm using the user root, and we have to lastly finally define what's going to be our database. So I have a database created, and what am I going to do? I'm going to start a very easy and a very simple database graphical administrator. It's a very simple interface called PHP MyAdmin. It's one of the most used environments to manage SQL database. So while my PHP admin is loading, we're going to do something else. We got to evaluate the connection. Just because I'm doing this, it doesn't mean that my connection is successfully established. Okay? So it would be very nice if I use a flux control block to evaluate the connection. And this flux control block could be an if. And what am I going to try to evaluate inside if? If this condition is accomplished, I mean, if this condition takes correctly the parameters that I am defining for the MySQLi function and everything goes right, nothing goes wrong, I just want to print a message by screen. So this message is going to be successful connection. Otherwise, if something goes wrong, I use my statement else. I don't need to evaluate anything inside else. So I'm just going to ask to print a different message inside. So I'm going to say it wasn't possible to make the connection. But remember something, we can use a PDO or we can use PHP native functions which can provide a more specified detail about the error which is happening. So what's the database we're going to use? Well, I was working on a little project in Granada in Spain, and I have this database. So just because I work in Brazil and Spain, sometimes I have to set up my applications in Portuguese or Spanish, but you're not gonna have any kind of problem with it. I'm going to explain everything. So I'm working with the server. I'm going to select this database and I'm going to put it as argument inside the argument string which I am defined as argument for my SQL connection through the variable connect, which is making a new calling to my SQLi function. So through this point, everything is okay. I'm going to select the database and I have two tables. Let's see the first table. Yes. We have ID, we have stock quantities, and we're going to buy products. And I have another table. The name of the table is product, and I have nice information here. Okay, we have a product ID, we have a product description, we have a vendor or provider. It's going to be very nice to work with this database. So this is the database that I'm going to use. Okay, now what happened with the classes? If I run this class, in my browser, nothing is going to happen. Just because I have to construct a new object from this class, and I have to instantiate the object inside this class. So my class is ORIn, and I only have one object by now in my class. This object is the function connection. It's a public function. So if I go to my browser and I call the name of the folder that we created, we're gonna find the index of the files archived inside this folder. So if I run this class and everything is okay, nothing is gonna happen, just because I need another file to instantiate the object and make a productive use of the objects that are inside my class. But what happens if I try to enforce an error? I'm going to change the name of the database. Nothing is going to happen. Oh, David, but why? Just because this is a class. But how can I catch errors? Well, that's what we're going to do in this new file. I'm going to create an instantiation file. Insta ORM is going to be the name of this file. I'm going to define the extension and the file type. So we have to be sure that file is inside the same folder where we are working. So what's next? The first thing I have to do is to build a new object from my class. Okay? So let's open our PHP tag. And just because the name of the archive or file where my class is in, I have to include it inside my new instance. So I'm going to use the statement include. The argument for include is going to be the root and the name of my file. But just because my file is in my local folder, I don't have to define a root. So I'm going to type the name of my file. Class ORIn.php. This is the name of the file. And now I can try to run this little program and I'm going to see what happened. But at first I have to build a new object, an instance from the class. What's the name of the class? It's ORIn. So I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to do something very interesting. I'm going to overload this variable with multiple functions. So I'm not going to create different variables to execute different functions. I'm going to use the same variable to execute several functions. So I'm overloading this variable. And what's going to happen? When I run the instance of my class using the same variable, I'm going to receive different behaviors. I'm going to receive different results in the same execution. This is what we call polymorphism on OOP. So this variable is going to be named ORIn, but ORIn is going to be a new constructor and I'm going to construct for my class ORM. And that's all. I'm not going to define any argument. And now I'm going to try to instantiate one object inside the class ORM. What's the object? This function, connection. So using the same variable, in this case, I'm not going to use it. I'm just making an instantiation. I'm going to use the name of my function, and this function is connection with no arguments by now, but you can be sure that lately, well, not lately, later, in a few minutes, I'm going to explain how to transfer values inside these two parentheses, which are going to be accepted inside the arguments I'm going to define in here. For example, I can create 1, 2, 3, 4 arguments in here, and I can pass values for those arguments from here. So the result is going to be very interesting. So I'm not going to need to write different functions if I need to connect to different databases. I simply use the MySQL native function, and through the function connection, I simply pass some values to the arguments, and according to the user, according what the user passed as values to the parameters, the program is going to provide a different response. And I'm accomplishing the role of the polymorphism in OOP. So let's try to run it. I go back, I reload, and now I have my Insta ORM. Look at this. My connection was successful. Just because everything is going on right here. But what happens if I change the name of the database? I'm going to receive another response. Well, David, I don't know where this database is. This is not right. This is not correct. There's something wrong. Everything's okay, but I'm trying to make a new construction. I'm trying to instantiate the creation of a new object, but in this process, I couldn't find this database. So we have a nice and simple function to establish a connection to our SQL database, MySQL database. Remember, in this class, we're not going to work with JavaScript or CSS or Bootstrap, okay? We're not going to decorate with visual functions or special functions or layout format, just because we're working with the backend. In the class number 6, we're going to work with elements like JavaScript, CSS, and a little bit of Bootstrap to make our project be visually beautiful. So let's keep on. Now that we found out the way to establish a successful connection to my SQL database. I'm going to create another public function. And this function is going to have its name. Let's suppose data table. Now I'm going to run a special SQL query, and I'm going to retrieve the information which is into my database, specifically from my selected tables, and I'm going to show the information through a simple HTML table. So let's start. The first thing I have to do is to call my global variable connection, just because I'm going to need to establish a connection to my database. Just doing this, everything is ready. I have everything I need to retrieve the parameters to my database connection. Now, I'm going to create another variable. This is not going to be a global one, and this variable is going to be data query. So data query is going to do something. What is going to do? Well, this is going to call, okay, to my SQL function, but this time my SQL function, but this time it's going to call the parameter query. But my SQL function is a variable. So what's the query? I have to run a query. And what is it going to be? Well, let's run a simple query there in my database, okay? But I have to combine information from my two tables. This is going to be a select. You know how to run, you know how to prepare an SQL statement. So let's go to our database, and I'm going to refresh my page, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to run a select. But what information do I need? Well, just because it's going to be a combined query using inner join, I'm going to be very formal, and I'm going to write it first, the name of my table, dot the name of the field that I'm trying to retrieve. My second field is going to be, for example, the quantity which is into the table for this product. But what happened? The quantity in stock is in this table, and this table is different, okay? Well, it's very simple. I have a relationship ID. I'm not using primary keys or foreign keys by the moment. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use inner join to relationship to establish a relationship between these two tables. How? Well, my second field is table and the quantity of units that I have on my stock. But from where? From my main table. Oh, that's right. But how am I going to combine these two tables? Well, I'm going to use an inner join with my secondary table. What's my secondary table? It's inventory. But what is going to be the relationship vector? I have to define it by using one special word, it's on. So there is a special column where I have a unique ID and I inside products, and I have a special column into the table inventory, which is named relational ID. So what am I going to retrieve? I'm going to retrieve the name of the products that I have in this table, into this table, and I'm going to retrieve the quantities for each product which I have in stock, establishing a relationship by ID. So let's execute, let's run, and here we have it. Delicious. So what am I going to do? I'm going to define the value for my SQLi, which is going to retrieve, every argument, the connection, just because I defined it, but I have a little mistake in here. It's not my SQLi, it's connect. Just because connect is the variable which is calling to my SQL and it's retrieving the parameters for connection. Well, forgive me just because of that. It's just because I'm accustomed to use the name MySQL every time I try to establish a connection. So in this case, for no confusion, I'm correcting, I'm rectifying, I'm verifying the name of the variable. So this is the global variable that I have to use. Now, connect is going to call to the query PHP function, and by executing this query after calling the connection to my SQLi, is going to let me to retrieve values, information from my tables inside my database. So what can I do now? I'm going to build a table. And to do it, I'm going to use HTML text. I'm going to build a table. I'm going to put it in the middle of the screen, right? And what else? Oh, I don't want it I don't want a very wide table. So I'm going to define a value, but this is going to be outside because it's another parameter. So let's suppose it's going to be a 60% of the screen. And I'm not going to define a special parameter, for example, for padding. I only want a simple borderline. You already know this HTML text. And here we go. I'm going to create a new TR just for open a new line, right? And I'm going to do something else. Let's see. I'm going to need some heads. So I'm going to open heads. But what are going to contain? What are they going to contain? What are those TH going to contain? They're going to contain the product name, and my quantity in stock. Okay. Now I have to close my TR just because now I have to evaluate this. So what is going to happen? Every time that this query finds a new line, a new row inside the table, a condition must be accomplished. So what condition? Well, this is a little difficult, but I think we could solve this by using a while. So I could try to say that, my God, my fingers are very gross, and this keyboard is terrible. So while, and what I'm going to evaluate inside this while, I'm going to create a new variable, okay, and this variable is going to be named rows, for example, and while rows be equal to who? To this little friend I have in here, just because this variable is responsible to execute the query, and she is calling to a connect function, which is the value for a global variable, and this global variable is in here. So everything is ready. While this function be accomplished, what am I going to do? I'm going to build new TRs, just because I'm going to need new lines. So every time the query finds a new line inside the result of this query, my program is going to build new TRs. So let's go. Print. What is it going to print? It's going to print new TR. But it's not going to build simple TR. Now I'm going to need to retrieve the rows. But, oh my God, I have to do something. I need an array. Yes, I'm going to need a comparison and association array. But how could I do this? I'm going to call a PHP native function called fetch sock. We were speaking about the fetch a sock and the fetch arrays. What this fetch sock is going to do is just to build a new array, and this array is going to be compared with, well, this array is going to have a structure, and this structure is going to be compared with the structure of my table in my database. So I think this is going to work perfectly. Now I can retrieve my values. How? Well, my friend, I'm going to be new TDs. And inside the TDs, I'm going to retrieve what? I'm going to retrieve the values which are going to come from the lines inside the tables of my database. So let's see. I have to separate HTML text from PHP pure code. But the responsible for retrieving the line is rows, this variable. So just because I'm using an array, I have to specify what is going to come from this array in the first case and in the second case. Oh my God. So what's the name of each field? The name of the product and the quantity of units that I have in my stock. But what is going to happen with my table? I have to close my TR in here. Well, in fact, I could do it inside here, but I'm going to do it independently. I'm going to print my TR closing, and something very important, I can't close my table in here, just because if I do it, the program is going to keep on building and closing TRs and tables every time it finds a new line. So my table closing is going to be in here. After the contour flux blow, the flux contour block finish. So my table is going to finish in here. Sorry, I need a new keyboard. So what do you think is going to happen after executing the connection by the function of the variable connect, which is global, and executing the query? and building the table and calling to a new method, which is fetch sock, I am going to retrieve through my new variable rows, which is going to push information from my query, the values inside the fields of my tables into the database. So let's run it and let's see what happens. Oh, we have a little problem here. What's the problem? I'm not instantiating this, okay? So for instantiating this, I have to do, what's the name of the function? Is data table. So using the same variable, ORIN, I am going to instantiate to data table. By this moment, we're not using arguments. And here we have. So something is going wrong. The table was built, but I have to analyze what's going on in my class on the line number 36. And we have a warning. There is a non-defined property. This property is the result of the fetch sock for my SQL in line 36. So here we go. Let's see. Line number 36. While rows be equal to data query calling to fetch a sock. We have to try to find what's going on with this. Just because my SQLi is not being correctly instantiated. So there is a not defined property on the result for a fetch a sock. So I'm not being able to retrieve the value, but we're going to solve this. So let's see. Well, that's right. Remember something? Fetch a sock is a native PHP function, so it's waiting for some arguments. And even if we're not going to use arguments, if we're not going to define arguments inside it, we have to open and close parentheses. So if we're working with a syntax a color definition code editor, you can see that the color changed. So I think the problem was just simple that I'm going to save it and I'm going to run it one more time. So here we have it. This is ready. It's beautiful. Now let's do something. Sometimes we don't want to watch errors. Okay, so what we do in those cases is simple. We take the instance and we use a PHP command which is named error reporting, and we use the parameter 0 inside. So when the product is ready and tested, we can use that, so we're not going to receive error messages. So let's do something. I'm going to change something in here. For example, I'm going to change the name of the field. So the interpreter is not going to recognize where this element is because it doesn't exist. So I'm going to do something. I'm going to run the program. And I don't have it, but where is my error message? Oh, remember. I can comment this, and if I refresh the page, I'm going to have the message. Oh, this K, which is a part of an array, is not defined. Where is it? Right. I'm going to change it. I'm going to leave it just as this was. I'm going to run it. I'm going to do it one more time. And I'm going to refresh the page, but I have the error. But now I'm going to go to my instance, and I'm going to take off the comment lines, and I'm going to refresh the page, and the error is absolutely on silence. So this is the purpose for this command. So I don't recommend to use the command while you are typing code. After testing the system, you can use it on your instances. Okay, so this is all for today. We're gonna work a little more tomorrow. We're going to develop a CRUD or CRUD. So we're going to learn how to write functions to update, delete, and insert everything inside one page. But for this, we're going to use some JavaScript to make the process easier. Thank you for your attention. Have a nice night. Good night for everybody, and see you tomorrow. Oh no, sorry, after tomorrow.